Robert Ellison was 58 years old, a career government administrator who had been assigned to the local draft board in a mid-sized American city. Ellison had served on the draft board for 3 years, processing draft classifications and making determinations about which young men would be drafted into military service in Vietnam. Ellison took his responsibility seriously. He believed in the necessity of the draft and in the importance of selecting men for military service. Ellison reviewed files and made decisions about classifications with the belief that he was performing an important governmental function. But in November 1967, Ellison was assigned to a temporary duty at a military induction center where newly drafted soldiers were being processed for assignment to military units. Ellison's temporary duty was to observe the induction process and to provide feedback to draft boards about how drafted soldiers were adapting to military service. At the induction center, Ellison observed newly drafted American soldiers arriving for basic training. The soldiers ranged in age from 18 to 35. Most were in their early 20s, drafted immediately after graduating from high school or college. The newly drafted American soldiers looked like what Ellison expected. They looked like young men transitioning to military service. They looked uncertain about their futures. Many looked frightened about the prospect of deployment to Vietnam.
Then Australian soldiers arrived at the same induction centre for training with American units. The Australian soldiers were on a training exchange program, conducting training with American soldiers to share Australian methodology and to improve American military effectiveness. The contrast between American drafted soldiers and Australian soldiers struck Ellison with unexpected force. The Australian soldiers looked like men. The American drafted soldiers looked like boys. The Australian soldiers, even the youngest among them, possessed a maturity and a physical presence that the American drafted soldiers did not possess. The Australian soldiers moved with confidence and capability. The Australian soldiers interacted with American military personnel with the ease of men who understood military operations and military culture. The American drafted soldiers, many of them only weeks removed from civilian life, moved with uncertainty. Many appeared overwhelmed by military structure and military expectations. Many appeared frightened about what military service would require of them. Ellison found himself confronted with a disturbing realization. The American draft was inducting young men who looked like boys. These young men possessed minimal military training and minimal military experience. They possessed minimal physical conditioning. They possessed minimal understanding of what military service would demand of them.
The Australian soldiers, by contrast, were volunteers who had undergone extensive training before arriving in Vietnam. The Australian soldiers possessed military experience and military capability that the American drafted soldiers did not possess. The realization troubled Ellison deeply. Ellison had spent 3 years making decisions about which American men would be drafted into military service. Ellison had believed that he was making appropriate decisions, that he was selecting men who were adequate for military service. But observing the contrast between drafted American soldiers and Australian soldiers forced Ellison to confront the possibility that drafted American soldiers were not adequate. Drafted American soldiers looked like boys who had been forced into military service against their will. Australian soldiers looked like men who had voluntarily chosen military service and who had prepared themselves appropriately for that service. Ellison spent 3 weeks at the induction center observing the processing of drafted soldiers and the training of Australian soldiers. During those 3 weeks, Ellison's perspective on the draft began to shift. The American drafted soldiers were being forced into military service with minimal preparation and minimal training. Many of these soldiers did not want to be in military service. Many of these soldiers were frightened about deployment to Vietnam. Many of these soldiers appeared inadequate to the demands of military service.
The Australian soldiers, by contrast, had voluntarily chosen military service. The Australian soldiers had undergone extensive training before arriving in Vietnam. The Australian soldiers appeared confident in their capabilities and in their training. Ellison observed an interaction between an Australian soldier and an American drafted soldier that crystallized his emerging understanding. An American drafted soldier, 18 years old and clearly frightened, asked an Australian soldier about what combat operations were like. The Australian soldier responded with professionalism and consideration. Combat is frightening. Combat requires you to function despite fear. Combat requires training and discipline and the support of soldiers around you. You will be frightened, but your training will carry you through. The American soldier listened to this response and appeared somewhat reassured. But Ellison observed that the American soldier still looked like a boy who had been forced into a situation he did not choose and for which he was minimally prepared. When Ellison returned to his draft board after his 3-week assignment at the induction center, his perspective on the draft had fundamentally changed. Ellison made a decision that would define the rest of his service on the draft board. I cannot, in good conscience, continue to draft young men who are inadequately prepared for military service, Ellison told his fellow draft board members.
The American draft is inducting young men who look like boys, who are frightened, who possess minimal military training or military experience. We are sending these young men to Vietnam without adequate preparation. The Australian military, by contrast, uses a volunteer system that allows soldiers to choose military service and to undergo extensive training before deployment. Ellison's colleagues were surprised by his declaration. Draft board members were not supposed to question the legitimacy of the draft system. Draft board members were supposed to process classifications and make determinations about who would be drafted. But Ellison had made an observation that could not be ignored. The Australian soldiers who were training with American units looked like men. The American drafted soldiers looked like boys. This comparison troubled Ellison and began to trouble other observers who witnessed the same contrast. Ellison continued to serve on his draft board, but he began to advocate for modifications to the draft system. Ellison argued that the draft system should be modified to ensure that drafted soldiers received more extensive training before deployment. Ellison argued that the draft system should be modified to allow for voluntary service as an alternative to compulsory conscription. Ellison's advocacy was not successful in changing the draft system. The draft remained compulsory throughout the remainder of the Vietnam War. Young men continued to be drafted with minimal preparation for military service. But Ellison's realization about the contrast between drafted American soldiers and Australian soldiers had contributed to a broader conversation about the legitimacy of the draft and the appropriateness of sending young men to Vietnam with minimal preparation. By 1969, the draft was becoming increasingly controversial. Young men were protesting against the draft. Parents were protesting against the draft. Questions were being raised about whether the draft was appropriate and whether young men should be compelled to serve in military service in Vietnam. Ellison's observation about the contrast between drafted American soldiers and Australian soldiers became part of this broader conversation. Ellison wrote an article in a local newspaper describing his observations at the induction center and his realization about how drafted American soldiers looked like boys compared to Australian soldiers who looked like men. The article attracted attention. Ellison was interviewed about his observations by journalists covering the draft controversy. Ellison became known as a draft board member who had questioned the legitimacy of the draft based on his observations of drafted soldiers' preparedness for military service. By 1970, the draft was effectively ending as American military presence in Vietnam was winding down. The draft had been controversial throughout the latter part of the Vietnam War. The draft had contributed to the broader social and political divisions that had characterized the Vietnam War era. Ellison's observation about the contrast between drafted American soldiers and Australian soldiers had contributed to the conversation about the draft, although his specific observation had been only one voice among many questioning the draft's appropriateness. When the draft ended in 1973, Ellison had retired from the draft board. He had spent approximately 7 years on the draft board, making determinations about which American men would be drafted into military service in Vietnam. In his final years, Ellison reflected on his service on the draft board and on the observation that had changed his perspective. The observation about the contrast between drafted American soldiers and Australian soldiers had forced Ellison to confront uncomfortable truths about the American military and about the draft system. When Ellison was interviewed years later about his experience on the draft board, he was frank about his regrets. "I made decisions that sent young men to Vietnam with minimal preparation for military service," Ellison said. "I made decisions that drafted young men who did not want military service and who were inadequately trained for the demands of combat. I made those decisions believing that I was performing an important governmental function. But when I observed the contrast between drafted American soldiers and Australian soldiers, I realized that the young men I had drafted were not adequate for the demands of military service." Ellison continued, "The Australian soldiers looked like men who had chosen military service and who had prepared themselves for that service. The American drafted soldiers looked like boys who had been forced into military service against their will and who had been given minimal preparation for the demands they would face. That contrast troubled me deeply, and it continues to trouble me." This reflection, made decades after the Vietnam War had ended, represented Ellison's mature understanding of what he had observed and what the observation had meant. By the year 2000, Ellison's observation about drafted American soldiers looking like boys compared to Australian soldiers looking like men had become part of the historical record regarding the draft and regarding American military personnel in Vietnam. Military historians cited Ellison's observation as evidence of the differences between drafted American soldiers and volunteer Australian soldiers. The observation was cited in discussions about the draft system and about the appropriateness of conscription. One military historian, Dr. James Patterson, wrote about Ellison's observation in a comprehensive study of the American draft during the Vietnam War. Robert Ellison's observation about the contrast between drafted American soldiers and Australian soldiers provides insight into how military personnel and military observers perceived the quality of drafted soldiers compared to soldiers from military systems based on volunteers, Patterson wrote. Ellison's observation suggests that drafted soldiers appeared less prepared and less confident than volunteer soldiers. This observation contributed to broader conversations about the appropriateness of the draft system and the quality of military personnel being inducted into military service. Ellison lived until the year 2004. In his final years, he was recognized by some observers as a figure who had recognized problems in the draft system and who had advocated for changes based on his observations. But Ellison was not celebrated as a hero. He was a minor figure in the larger history of the Vietnam War and the draft controversy. His observation about drafted soldiers looking like boys compared to Australian soldiers looking like men had contributed to discussions about the draft. But Ellison had not been instrumental in ending the draft or in changing the draft system. The observation remained significant nonetheless. The observation captured something true about the contrast between drafted American soldiers and Australian volunteer soldiers. The observation captured something about the quality of military personnel being inducted into military service and the appropriateness of sending minimally prepared young men to Vietnam. By the year 2020, more than 50 years after Ellison had made his observation, the observation had become part of military history. The observation was cited when discussions occurred about the draft system or about the quality of military personnel during the Vietnam War era. The slouch hat represented Australian military effectiveness. Ellison's observation about drafted soldiers looking like boys compared to Australian soldiers looking like men represented something different. The observation represented the human cost of the draft system and the contrast between compulsory military service and volunteer military service. These represented different kinds of Australian influence on American military and on American understanding of military service and military preparedness. The Australian presence in Vietnam had demonstrated the effectiveness of volunteer military personnel who had undergone extensive training before deployment. The contrast between Australian soldiers and drafted American soldiers had raised questions about whether compulsory conscription was appropriate and whether drafted soldiers were adequately prepared for military service.
These questions had contributed to broader conversations about the draft that had ultimately resulted in the draft being ended in 1973. Ellison's observation, while made by a relatively minor figure, had contributed to that broader conversation. The observation had demonstrated that military personnel and military observers were recognizing the qualitative difference between drafted soldiers and trained volunteer soldiers. By the year 2025, the draft had been ended for more than 50 years. The American military operated with an all-volunteer force. The contrast between drafted soldiers and Australian volunteer soldiers had become a historical matter rather than a contemporary issue. But the principle that Ellison had recognized, that volunteer soldiers who had undergone extensive training were qualitatively different from drafted soldiers with minimal training, remained relevant. Military effectiveness was partly a function of how soldiers were selected and how thoroughly soldiers were trained before deployment. The Australian military's volunteer system and extensive training methodology had produced soldiers who looked like men and who demonstrated capability and professionalism. The American draft system had produced soldiers who looked like boys and who appeared frightened and inadequately prepared for military service. That contrast, captured in Robert Ellison's observation, had contributed to broader conversations about military preparedness and military service that had persisted long after the Vietnam War had ended.